America doesn't feel like America anymore. And I don't mean politically, I mean something deeper than that. People with jobs can't afford rent. Families earning $90,000 a year are choosing between bills. College graduates are moving back in with their parents. And nobody has a clean answer for why. Because on paper, everything looks fine. But something underneath the whole system quietly shifted. And most people can feel it. They just can't name it. That's exactly what this video is about. What America was actually selling. To understand what's disappearing, you first have to understand what people once had. And here's the thing, it wasn't wealth. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even that remarkable by any objective standard. Picture a household in the mid-1970s. A mid-size city, Cincinnati, Sacramento, it doesn't matter. One income, a modest house, one car, 2 weeks off in the summer, no investment portfolio, nothing extravagant, but something more durable than any of that was present in that house. A quiet certainty that next year would be okay. That the kids could go to a state university and graduate employable without debt that followed them into middle age. That a serious illness wouldn't permanently erase the family's financial footing. That if you stayed the course and worked honestly, life moved in one direction, forward. That feeling, that specific unspectacular sense of stability, was the actual product America was selling. And for several decades, it was real. Widespread enough that it became a cultural baseline. It was simply what ordinary looked like. And here's what made it so powerful. It didn't require perfection. It didn't require connections or luck or a family name. It just required showing up consistently and trusting that the system would hold up its end of the deal. That was the agreement. Informal, unwritten, but understood by nearly everyone. Work hard, live responsibly, and the ground beneath your feet will stay solid. That was the promise, not riches, solid ground. Now look at what ordinary looks like today, and ask yourself when that changed. Because it didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, in a way most people didn't notice until they were already well behind where they expected to be. The sentence that says everything. There's one sentence showing up everywhere right now. In surveys, in interviews, in comment sections, and break rooms and late-night conversations between people who barely know each other. I earn more than my parents did, and I live worse. That sentence deserves a moment, because it isn't just a complaint. It's a verdict. It's a direct statement that the foundational promise of American life, the idea that each generation climbs higher than the last, has quietly stopped working. But here's where it gets harder to dismiss. The people saying this are not, by most measures, struggling. They have jobs, cars, phones, streaming services. By a narrow reading of the numbers, they're fine, just not forward. And that gap between fine and forward is where the real story lives. Being poor means the question is how to survive today. Falling behind means something different. It means you can see exactly where you're supposed to be. You can see the destination. And no matter how consistently you show up, it isn't getting closer. That's a different kind of pain. And it's one that almost no economic statistic fully captures because the statistics measure income. They employment rates. They measure GDP growth. What they don't measure is the distance between where someone expected to be and where they actually are. They don't measure the feeling of running hard and staying still. They don't measure the specific exhaustion of doing everything right and watching the finish line move further away anyway. That's the gap the data misses. And it's the gap millions of people are living inside right now. So what actually caused it? When the math stopped adding up, the honest answer isn't dramatic. There was no single breaking point. No moment you could point to and say that's when it changed. What happened was quieter than that. The costs of a normal life outpaced the growth of normal wages. Not suddenly, not in one category. Steadily across decades, in dozens of places at once, rent in most major American cities has increased at a pace completely disconnected from income growth. Cities like Denver, Nashville, Phoenix, and Raleigh have seen asking rents roughly double within a single decade. Not because those cities got dramatically wealthier for the people actually living there. The economics of who owns what simply shifted. Mortgage rates, which sat near historic lows through most of the early 2010s, climbed sharply in 2022 and 2023, arriving at exactly the moment when home prices had already peaked. The monthly cost of buying a medium-priced home in 2024 was in most markets higher relative to median income than at any recorded point in modern history. Healthcare costs have grown at roughly twice the rate of general inflation for 30 consecutive years. The average employer-sponsored family insurance premium now exceeds $25,000 annually. Workers pay a share of that, but that share has grown, and the out-of-pocket costs sitting on top of those premiums have grown even faster. And then there's the pressure that doesn't show up on any single bill. The insurance renewal in October, a few hundred higher than last year. The grocery run that's 30% heavier, without anything obviously different in the cart. The copay increase, the utility adjustment, the subscription that quietly went up again. None of those things breaks a household on its own. But together, compounding year after year, they create something millions of people are describing with the same image. A slow leak. Not a blowout, a quiet, invisible leak you only notice when you look down and realize how much air is already gone. Here's how significant that leak actually is. Economists have estimated that $90,000 to $100,000 in annual household income today buys roughly the same standard of living that $50,000 to $60,000 purchased in the early 1990s. Once you account for the cost that inflated fastest, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, the number on the paycheck got bigger, the life it buys got smaller. And what makes that especially difficult to process is that it happened invisibly. There was no announcement, no news cycle declaring that the deal had changed. People just kept following the same rules they'd always been given. Work hard, spend carefully, save what you can, and slowly realize the rules were producing different results than they used to. That's a disorienting thing to discover, especially when you can't point to a single moment when it went wrong. Take a breath here, because that's a genuinely heavy thing to sit with. But it's still not the deepest part of the problem. What's underneath it is harder to measure and harder to accept. Before we go further, does any of this match what you're seeing in your own life? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what people are experiencing out there. The difference between hardship and betrayal. There's a distinction that almost never gets made in these conversations, and it matters more than almost anything else. Struggling with money is a hardship. Feeling that the system you trusted has stopped working for you. That's something else entirely. That's betrayal. And increasingly, that second thing is what people are actually experiencing. Here's what that looks like up close. A young woman does everything correctly. Studies hard, attends a 4-year university, borrows around $50,000 in federal loans because her family couldn't cover tuition, and because every adult in her life told her the degree was the path. She graduates, lands a job in her field, starts earning $48,000 a year, which sounds reasonable until you run the actual numbers. Taxes, loan repayment, rent in a city where work in her field actually exists. When you subtract those three things, the math doesn't leave room to save. It barely leaves room to maintain. She's not failing. By every measurable standard, she is exactly where the path she was sold was supposed to lead. But she cannot save. She can't move toward a down payment. She is not getting ahead. She is holding position. And holding position, working full-time, carrying a degree, doing everything right, was not what she was told she was signing up for. She doesn't compare herself to billionaires. That comparison feels beside the point. She compares herself to her mother, who started working at 22 without a degree, bought a house at 27, and had a retirement account with real money in it before 35. That comparison isn't abstract, it's immediate, it's visible, and it's confusing in a way that pure financial stress alone doesn't produce. Why could that generation do what this one cannot? What actually changed? And why does no one seem able to give a straight answer? Here's part of the answer, and it's one that rarely gets said directly. The path that worked for previous generations was built on a specific set of conditions: affordable housing relative to income, healthcare that didn't consume a growing share of every paycheck, education that could be funded by working summers without graduating into decades of debt. Those conditions existed, they were real, and then gradually they stopped being real, while the advice to follow the same path kept getting passed down as if nothing had changed. That's the gap nobody talks about. The instructions stayed the same. The environment they were designed for quietly disappeared. That confusion, multiplied across millions of households, is where the real emotional story of modern America lives. And eventually, confusion doesn't stay confusion. It hardens into something more lasting. When people stop trusting the system, notice the specific language people use today when they talk about the institutions around them. They don't say healthcare is expensive. They say it's a maze designed to drain you. They don't say college was overpriced. They say it was a gamble that didn't pay off. They don't say rent is high. They say the whole thing is rigged. Those aren't the words of people who gave up. Most of them are still paying their premiums, still making loan payments, still showing up every morning to jobs that feel increasingly insufficient. These are people who are fully inside the system and who have stopped believing the system is working for them. That distinction matters more than it might seem because a recession, an actual economic recession, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's painful, but it's something you can read. You can see it on a chart. Americans have navigated recessions before and come out the other side. What is much harder to navigate is the slow erosion of institutional trust. Trust doesn't replenish with an interest rate cut. It doesn't recover because a quarterly report looks better. It rebuilds slowly over years through consistent evidence that the structures people depend on are actually working in their favor. And here's why that matters so much. When people trust institutions, they engage with them. They contribute to retirement accounts because they believe the market will reward patience. They invest in education because they believe it opens doors. They buy homes because they believe ownership builds security over time. Trust is not just an emotion. It's the engine that makes long-term financial behavior possible. When trust erodes, that engine stalls. People stop making long-term decisions because long-term thinking requires confidence in a future that feels uncertain. And when enough people stop making those decisions simultaneously, the effects ripple outward in ways that are very difficult to reverse. Think of it this way. Imagine someone who's driven the same highway to work for 15 years. Every curve is automatic. Every exit is memorized. Then one year, small cracks appear in the road. A guardrail section starts to look rusted. The lighting in a long tunnel begins to flicker. Nothing stops the car. They still arrive on time every morning, but they've stopped trusting the road in a way they never had to think about before. And once that trust is gone, every drive feels different, even on days when nothing goes wrong. That's where a significant portion of Americans now live, not in collapse. The car is still running. The road is technically passable. But the confidence in the infrastructure underneath has cracked. And cracked infrastructure produces something almost as debilitating as collapse: constant low-grade vigilance. The feeling that you cannot stop watching, that one unexpected expense, one disruption, one health event is all that separates your current life from a genuine crisis. That vigilance is exhausting. And sustained exhaustion like that changes what people are willing to reach for. It changes what they believe is even possible. The nostalgia that isn't about the past. Here's something worth looking at more carefully than most people do. Over the past decade, nostalgia for the 1980s and 1990s has become one of the dominant cultural forces in America. The music, the aesthetic, the visual language of that era is everywhere in television, film, fashion, social media. And here's the part that's easy to overlook. A significant share of the people expressing this nostalgia were children during that era. Some weren't born yet. So what are they actually nostalgic for? Because it isn't dial-up internet. It isn't VHS tapes. The 1990s weren't a golden age by any objective measure. There were recessions, crime, inequality, serious unresolved problems. What people are longing for isn't a time period. It's a feeling that time period represented. The feeling that the future was open, that a reasonable path forward existed if you worked for it, that the ground was stable enough, you didn't have to think about it constantly. For large parts of the middle class, that era had a quality that felt like expansion, like the horizon was getting closer rather than retreating. That's what the nostalgia is pointing at. Not a decade, a specific texture of living that people believe has become genuinely scarce. There's actually something important in human psychology here. When people feel secure about the future, they tend to look forward. They plan. They invest. They take reasonable risks. When they feel uncertain about the future, they instinctively turn toward what they already know survived. Memory becomes a map when the road ahead stops feeling reliable. That's not weakness. That's a rational response to uncertainty. The mind gravitates toward what it knows worked, even if that version of the past is slightly more polished in memory than it was in reality. And when the present feels unstable and the future feels uncertain, memory becomes a refuge. Not because it's accurate. It rarely is, but because it's safe. You already survived that time. You know how it ends. The remembered past offers a security the present simply cannot. When a whole society starts looking backward more intensely than it looks forward, that's not just sentiment, that's a signal. Something in the present is broken in a way people can feel but struggle to name. And the scale of that backward glance, how widespread it is, how intense it is, how it crosses generations who didn't even live through the era they're longing for, tells you something important about how deep that break actually goes. If this is giving you a clearer picture of what's actually happening, a like genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people. It only takes a second, from building to surviving. For most of the 20th century, the psychological orientation of American middle-class life pointed in one direction: forward. You work to build things, a career, a household, a retirement. You saved toward goals that took time but were expected to arrive. The house, the paid-off car, the college fund, the retirement account. These weren't fantasies. They were plans, and for most families working within the system, they were plans that actually worked. The question people asked themselves, even in hard years, was simple: what am I building toward? Now listen to the question that increasing numbers of Americans report asking themselves today. Not what am I building, but how do I not fall apart this month? That is not a small shift in wording. That is a complete inversion of direction. From accumulation to protection. From reaching toward the future to defending against it. You see it in financial behavior. A generation ago, buying a first home was the natural next step after getting established. Today, among younger households, maintaining a 3-month emergency fund is treated as a genuine achievement. Paying off a credit card is a milestone worth mentioning. Not because ambition shrank, because the margin shrank. The space between functioning and crisis has narrowed so much that protecting what you have is simply the most rational available move. You see it in life decisions that once ran on ordinary timelines. The average age of first marriage keeps climbing. Having children is being delayed or skipped, not primarily because values changed, but because of material calculation. People who want children are running the numbers on healthcare, childcare, housing, and education, and concluding they need to wait for conditions to improve, even as conditions show little sign of improving. You see it in the return of multi-generational living. Employed, educated adults in their late 20s and 30s back in childhood bedrooms. Not because family bonds deepened, because the arithmetic of living, independently, stopped working across a growing number of American cities. A previous generation asked how to succeed. A growing number of people today ask how to avoid falling further behind. Same country, same culture, completely different question. And the weight of that difference is hard to overstate, because the questions a society asks itself shape the decisions it makes. A culture oriented around building takes risks. It starts businesses. It moves to new cities for new opportunities. It invests in things that take years to pay off. A culture oriented around not falling apart does the opposite. It plays it safe. It stays put. It holds tight to what it has rather than reaching for what it doesn't. Neither of those is a moral failing. Both are rational responses to the environment people are actually living in. But they produce very different societies over time. The psychologist Abraham Maslow described something directly relevant here. People only move toward higher pursuits, purpose, creativity, growth, belonging, once their basic security needs are stable. When security is threatened, people pull back. They stop thinking about what they could build and start thinking about what they can hold on to. A society operating at that level of persistent anxiety produces less innovation, less civic engagement, less willingness to invest in anything long-term. Not because the people are less capable, but because the cognitive and emotional energy required for those things gets fully consumed by the daily work of staying afloat. That's the real cost of a survival mentality. Not just what individuals miss out on, the collective capacity that gets redirected away from creating and toward defending, and at scale that matters enormously. A country where millions of people are permanently in defensive mode isn't simply a country with an economic problem. It's a country where the psychological conditions for growth have quietly eroded. And once that erosion sets in deeply enough, it becomes self-reinforcing. Less investment leads to fewer opportunities. Fewer opportunities justify less investment. The cycle tightens. Which brings us to the deepest part of this story. The part that connects all of it. The thing underneath everything else. Here's the truth that ties every part of this together. The housing costs, the wage stagnation, the healthcare burden, the debt load, the survival mentality, the nostalgia, these are all real. They're all serious, but they're symptoms. The underlying condition, the thing that makes all of these specific problems collectively so damaging, is something harder to measure, but far more important to understand: the loss of forward belief. America wasn't built on wealth. It was built on a specific kind of structural optimism. Not the naive kind. Not the idea that everything is always fine, but a durable, functional belief that the direction things were moving was upward. That your children would have more options than you did. That sustained, honest effort pointed somewhere real. That belief was never equally distributed. The history of this country includes long stretches where the promise was theoretical rather than lived for large portions of its own people. Progress has never moved at the same speed for everyone. That's an important truth that shouldn't get lost here. But even with that history, there was something real and consequential about the broad consensus that effort had direction. That the system, imperfect and uneven as it was, had a working mechanism at its center. That staying in it and working within it generally bent the trajectory upward, even when specific years were difficult. What appears to be happening now is not a difficult economic cycle. Cycles have a shape, they contract, they expand. Americans have navigated plenty of them. What's happening now is a growing, broad-based loss of confidence that the mechanism itself still works. Not just at the margins, but among people who are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And that is a fundamentally different problem. Because you can fix a recession with policy, you can address a market correction with time, but you cannot legislate belief back into existence. You cannot pass a bill that restores confidence. Trust that has been lost at this scale rebuilds slowly, through actions sustained over long periods. And it only rebuilds at all if the underlying conditions that eroded it actually change. That's what makes this moment genuinely significant. Not the economic data on its own, but the combination of real structural pressure and the psychological response to it. Both are happening simultaneously, and together they create something that's harder to reverse than either one alone. The question that actually matters. A country can absorb a remarkable amount of hardship when its people believe the difficulty is temporary and the direction is still correct. When you run out of fuel on a long road trip, you're frustrated. But if you believe the destination is real and the road leads there, you find a way. You call for help. You wait. You push the car if you have to. You do what it takes because the destination itself isn't in question. The harder situation, the psychologically more costly one, is when people are no longer sure the road leads where they were told it did. Because at that point, effort becomes harder to sustain. The whole logic of sacrificing in the present for a future payoff depends on believing the future payoff is real. When that belief starts to weaken, the calculus of putting off gratification today for something better tomorrow, which is the foundation of how middle-class life is structured, starts to come apart. That's what the phrase, "America is no longer America," actually means when people say it. It's not a geographic observation. It's not a purely political statement. It's an emotional statement about a broken contract. The experience of reaching into a pocket where something essential used to be and finding it empty. The streets are still there. The economy is still, by aggregate measures, one of the largest and most productive in the world. The innovation is real. The technology is extraordinary. But capability isn't the same as direction. Power isn't the same as promise. What millions of people are mourning isn't the loss of what America can do. It's the loss of the sense that what America does is organized, at least in part, around giving ordinary people a stable and improving life. When that sense fades, something fundamental shifts, not loudly, not all at once. The surface stays relatively intact. People go to work, pay their taxes, raise their kids, but underneath, the agreement that held things together, the one that said sustained, honest effort would be rewarded, is under pressure in a way that hasn't been true for most of this country's history. And the first step toward any kind of repair isn't a policy. It's not a program or a package or a plan. It's seeing this clearly, acknowledging that what people are feeling isn't confusion or ingratitude or weakness. It's a rational response to real conditions. It's what happens when the world people were prepared for and the world that actually exists diverge far enough that the gap can no longer be explained away. A nation doesn't begin to weaken when it runs out of money. It begins to weaken when enough of its people stop believing that tomorrow will be better than today. That belief has carried this country through its hardest periods before, through depressions and wars and long stretches where the path forward wasn't clear. What made recovery possible in those moments wasn't just policy or resources. It was the stubborn, persistent conviction that the country was still worth working toward, that the efforts still meant something, that the destination was still real. Whether that conviction can be rebuilt now, and what it would honestly take to rebuild it, is the question that deserves far more serious attention than it's currently getting. Because this conversation isn't really about the past. It never was. It's about what kind of future we're actually willing to reckon with. So, I want to ask you directly, do you think the American dream is changing shape? Or do you think it's genuinely fading? Tell me in the comments. I read them. To understand how the ground beneath the American middle class cracked, we have to look at the structural mechanics of the last 50 years. This is not a story of sudden cosmic bad luck. It is a story of deliberate policy design, corporate restructuring, and macroeconomic shifts that systematically rerouted the flow of wealth in the United States. The year 1971 serves as the critical line of demarcation. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, completely decoupling the US dollar from physical gold and introducing a pure fiat currency system. This single monetary decision altered the relationship between economic productivity and labor compensation. For the 3 decades following World War II, a clear economic rule applied. As workers became more productive, their wages increased in near-perfect lockstep. Between 1948 and 1973, productivity grew by 96.7%, while hourly compensation grew by 91.3%. The gains of growth were shared almost equally between capital owners and laborers. Then the lines severed. Data from the Economic Policy Institute shows that between 1973 and 2022, net productivity in the United States increased by 64.6%, while real hourly compensation for the average worker increased by just 14.8%. The massive financial surplus generated by American worker efficiencies stopped flowing into paychecks. Instead, it was redirected into corporate profits, executive compensation, and Wall Street financial instruments. This phenomenon, which economists call the Great Decoupling, meant that hard work no longer guaranteed a proportional increase in material well-being. The rules of the economic game had fundamentally mutated without an official announcement. Simultaneously, the structural landscape of American industry underwent deep alterations. The late 1970s and 1980s marked the acceleration of deindustrialization. Manufacturing hubs across the Midwest and Northeast, cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, and Gary, saw their economic foundation dismantled. Trade policies, corporate tax structures, and the rise of globalized supply chains made it financially advantageous for corporations to offshore production to low-wage countries. Millions of secure, unionized, high-wage manufacturing jobs vanished from the domestic economy. They were replaced by a bifurcated service economy, which split the workforce into high-income knowledge sectors and low-wage retail, hospitality, and administrative jobs. The industrial floor that had consistently held up the working class was stripped away. The erosion deepened with the systematic dismantling of labor unions. In 1954, roughly 35% of all non-agricultural workers in the United States belonged to a union, providing a powerful collective mechanism to negotiate wage growth, comprehensive health benefits, and secure pensions. By 1983, union density had fallen to 20.1%, and by 2023, it dropped to a historic low of 10.0%. The loss of union bargaining power directly corresponds with the stagnation of middle-class incomes. Without organized labor to advocate for workers, corporate boards prioritize shareholder primacy, a corporate governance philosophy popularized by economist Milton Friedman. This doctrine asserted that a corporation's sole social responsibility was to maximize value for its shareholders. To achieve this, companies altered how they allocated capital. In the mid-20th century, companies routinely reinvested a significant portion of their earnings back into their workforces through training, pension funds, and steady wage increases. The adoption of shareholder primacy shifted those priorities completely towards stock buybacks and dividend payments. Stock buybacks, which were classified as illegal market manipulation by the Securities and Exchange Commission until deregulation in 1982 under Rule 10b-18, became standard practice. Instead of investing in labor, corporations used hundreds of billions of dollars annually to purchase their own stock, artificially inflating share prices to enrich executive boards and institutional investors. As wages stagnated, the cost of the basic necessities required to sustain a middle-class life experienced unprecedented inflation. The geographic trap emerged as housing became financialized. For generations, housing was treated primarily as shelter and a localized method for long-term savings. However, the deregulation of the banking industry in the 1980s and 1990s, culminating in the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, integrated local real estate markets into global financial networks. Mortgage-backed securities and institutional investment vehicles turned American neighborhoods into speculative asset classes. Real estate values became detached from the actual median incomes of the local populations. Between 1970 and 2024, the median sales price of a house in the United States increased by over 400% when adjusted for inflation, while median household income grew by less than 30% during that exact same time frame. This created a profound geographic lock-in. The cities with the most dynamic job growth, public infrastructure, and economic opportunities, such as New York, San Francisco, Boston, and Seattle, became entirely unaffordable for median wage earners. Workers were forced into long, resource-draining commutes from distant exurbs or compelled to allocate 40, 50, or even 60% of their pre-tax income strictly toward monthly rent, leaving them highly vulnerable to minor financial disruptions. The structural deficit extended directly into higher education and healthcare. In 1965, the Higher Education Act was passed, with the intent of making a college education accessible to all citizens. For decades, public state universities were heavily subsidized by state government appropriations, allowing students to pay tuition through part-time summer jobs. However, over the past 40 years, state governments steadily reduced their fiscal funding for public higher education. To make up the revenue shortfall, universities shifted the financial burden directly onto students through skyrocketing tuition fees. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, the average cost of undergraduate tuition, fees, room, and board at public four-year institutions increased by 169% between 1980 and 2020. Even after adjusting for inflation, this hyperinflation forced generations into the student loan complex. Total outstanding student loan debt in the United States reached $1.7 trillion, turning an entire demographic of young workers into debt debtors before they entered the full-time labor market. Healthcare followed an identical hyperinflationary trajectory, driven by the complex privatized system of employer-sponsored health insurance, pharmaceutical pricing power, and hospital consolidation. The cost of medical care outpaced general economic inflation every single year for 3 consecutive decades, transforming a routine medical diagnosis into a potent driver of personal bankruptcy. The combined effect of these structural shifts was a complete reversal of economic reality. While the cost of entering and maintaining a middle-class life multiplied exponentially, the financial compensation provided by ordinary work remained flatly stagnant. The abstract economic models of the past have now materialized into a visible, split-screen reality across the American landscape. Economists officially classify this current environment as a K-shaped economy, a structural phenomenon where asset owners accumulate unprecedented capital while wage earners face a compounding deficit. This divergence is not an opinion. It is quantified by hard institutional data. According to the 2026 Global Wealth data published by UBS, the average wealth per adult in the United States reached an extraordinary $696,277, ranking the nation second globally. However, the median wealth per American adult, the figure reflecting the exact middle of the population, sat at just $68,998, dropping the United States to 28th place globally. Between 2020 and 2025, the average American wealth rose by 10%, while the median wealth plummeted by 20%. This divergence indicates that the vast macroeconomic gains of the post-pandemic era did not distribute into the broader economy, but instead concentrated heavily within the upper modern asset class. www.allianz.com, the primary battlefield of this economic friction is the domestic housing market, where a direct clash between corporate capital and traditional home buyers has effectively closed the door to entry-level ownership. By the beginning of 2026, real estate investors commanded a historic 30 to 34% market share of all single-family home purchases across the United States. This represents a significant transformation in market composition. Data from public records reveals that the historical gap between traditional owner-occupant buyers and real estate investors narrowed from 270,000 units to just 110,000 units within a 4-year window. The operational advantage for these investors rests entirely on liquidity. Roughly 60% of investor acquisitions are conducted via all-cash transactions. In an environment where the Federal Reserve maintained elevated interest rates, pushing traditional 30-year fixed mortgage payments up by $800 to $1,000 per month, relative to the early 2010s, cash-rich investors effortlessly bypassed financing hurdles. They systematically targeted older, entry-level properties priced below the national average, directly outbidding local families who required traditional mortgage financing. w.cotality.com. Issue 1. This corporate saturation is heavily concentrated within high-growth regional hubs. Geographically, 5 states, Texas, California, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, now account for approximately 1/3 of all investor-owned single-family homes in the country. Texas alone contains over 1.4 million investor-held residential properties, followed closely by California with 1.2 million and Florida with over 1 million. In metro areas such as Asheville, North Carolina, investor ownership of single-family rentals has reached nearly 30%. The financialization of these local markets has created a profound regulatory gridlock. While federal lawmakers have repeatedly proposed legislation to penalize or restrict large institutional buyers, banking reports from institutions like Bank of America suggest that a simple ban on large firms would fail to resolve the core structural deficit. This is because the vast majority of investment volume, nearly 92%, is driven not by megacorporations with thousands of homes, but by highly aggregated networks of small and medium-scale investors owning between 1 and 100 properties. These mid-tier entities operate locally, utilize automated property management software, and implement algorithmic pricing models that steadily drive up area rents entirely independent of local wage trends. NationalMortgageProfessional.com, the direct human cost of this structural tightening is captured in the 2026 financial tracking data compiled by research firms like Ramsey Solutions. The proportion of the American population living strictly paycheck to paycheck rose to 54%, a sharp increase from 42% recorded just 5 years prior. Furthermore, 34% of United States adults now formally describe their personal financial situation as struggling or in crisis, representing a 55% inflation in financial distress since 2021. The pressure is explicitly demographic. The rate of financial crisis among single individuals jumped from 30% to 45% over this 5-year period, while over 52% of Generation X respondents reported severe daily difficulty managing baseline monthly expenses. This stress is driven by the reality that while core inflation indexes have stabilized on federal charts, the actual nominal prices of everyday essentials remain locked at their peak post-inflationary levels. Food costs serve as a stark baseline. 36% of Americans currently report that providing basic nutrition for their household is a persistent challenge, compared to 30% in the immediate post-pandemic years. www.ramseysolutions.com. This structural dead end has systematically altered daily middle-class consumer behavior, forcing a rollback of activities that once defined standard American life. Industry analyses from organizations like McKinsey and Circana document a widening divergence in discretionary spending based strictly on income brackets. For the typical middle-income family, routine habits like dining out have transformed into calculated luxuries, as sit-down restaurant prices rose 6% through late 2025, significantly outperforming general grocery inflation due to compounding labor, real estate, and supply overheads. The tech sector exhibits an identical pattern. Higher-income consumers continue to drive growth in electronics, while middle and lower-income households are actively extending the operational life of their existing personal devices or pulling out of the market entirely. International and domestic travel have followed a similar trajectory, with escalating lodging, fuel, and transportation costs forcing average families to abandon annual vacations. The functional reality of 2026 is an economy where the superficial markers of middle-class status are being preserved through high-interest consumer debt, while the actual foundational security required to sustain that status has been completely hollowed out by institutional forces.